Good evening, and welcome to tonight's journey into the shadows. Tonight, we are venturing deep into the heart of the forest, far away from the comfort of city lights, where the air is thick, the trees tower like silent sentinels, and the unknown waits patiently in every corner. If you've ever felt the thrill of being watched when you're alone, or the chill of realizing something is just beyond your vision, you're in the right place. Make sure you're comfortable, the lights are low, and remember, every sound you hear tonight is a story, and every story is true. Our first tale begins in the remote wilderness of northern New Hampshire, where the white mountains stretch for miles and silence dominates the landscape. A family cabin sits isolated atop a ridge, accessible only by a winding dirt road that vanishes into dense pine forests. The cabin, constructed decades ago, has seen generations of families, each returning year after year for solitude, for the comfort of firelight, and for the freedom that comes with being off the grid. But freedom in the woods comes with a price that some never truly understand until it is too late. One autumn evening, a group of 3 friends arrived at the cabin, eager to escape the suffocating routine of urban life. Their plan was simple: hike, fish, and spend nights by the fireplace, sharing stories over warm drinks. But as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in orange and violet, an uneasy sensation began to settle over the cabin. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and shadows stretched unnaturally long across the wooden floors. At first, they dismissed it as the after effect of a long drive, a trick of the mind adjusting to solitude. But as darkness fully descended, subtle signs began to hint that something was amiss. It started with sounds, not the usual creaks of a wooden cabin or the rustling of pine needles in the wind, but something else, deliberate, irregular, and close. A branch snapping outside their window, as if someone or something was stepping lightly on the forest floor. They exchanged nervous glances, but laughter covered the unease. They joked about bears, or maybe a wandering hunter. Yet the instinctive tension remained. One friend, Mark, a skeptic by nature, insisted they were imagining things. "This is just the woods," he said. "You're looking for ghosts and finding them in every shadow." But the feeling in the pit of their stomachs refused to be silenced. Later that night, as they settled into bed, a new sound disturbed the quiet. A whisper, faint, almost unintelligible, but unmistakable in its intention. It was not the wind. It was too deliberate, too close. Emily, the most sensitive of the group, strained her ears. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "It's like someone's outside." The others, now fully awake, listened. There it was again. Soft footsteps circling the cabin, stopping, then starting again. The sound moved in a pattern, almost as if pacing, and always paused just beyond their vision. Unable to resist, Mark grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, calling into the darkness. "Hello? Is someone there?" The beam cut through the thick night air, illuminating nothing but trees and undergrowth. For a long moment, silence answered. Then, as if in response, a figure emerged at the edge of the tree line. A tall, thin silhouette, unnervingly still. Its features were indistinct, shadowed, but the posture radiated intent. Before Mark could react, it vanished. No sound of retreat, no trace, just gone. The others watched from the doorway, hearts pounding, as Mark returned inside, pale and shaking. I don't know what that was," he said. Sleep became impossible. Each creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, sounded amplified, as if the forest itself was alive and observing. They tried to convince themselves to rest, but the stories shared in the flickering firelight now felt dangerously prophetic. Emily began to recount a tale she had read online about a phenomenon known in the region as the Hollow Watcher, an entity said to inhabit the deepest parts of the forest, appearing to those who venture too far from civilization. Supposedly, it did not attack directly, but lingered, observing, a silent predator that fed off fear. Mark scoffed, but even he could not shake the sensation of being watched. By dawn, the trio had decided to explore the surrounding area, thinking daylight would banish whatever haunted their night. They hiked along the narrow trails, the forest thickening around them with every step. Birds were conspicuously absent. The usual hum of insects muted. It was as though the forest itself held its breath. Then, among the underbrush, they found something chilling. Footprints. Not human, not exactly. Elongated and narrow, with impressions that suggested talons rather than toes. The tracks led from the ridge down into a marshy valley, disappearing into mist that hovered over stagnant water. None of them spoke for a moment, the weight of realization settling in. Returning to the cabin, they noticed subtle changes. Doors slightly ajar that they remembered closing. Small items moved from their original places. The sense of intrusion was undeniable. They argued briefly, tension rising, blaming each other for negligence. But deep down they knew none of them had touched the objects. It was then that Emily noticed the faint, almost imperceptible marks on the windowsill. Long, narrow scratches, like fingernails dragging across the wood, pointing inward. The evidence was undeniable. Whatever had been outside the night before, it had not left, and it had found a way in. Afternoon brought no relief. The oppressive atmosphere persisted, thickening as clouds rolled in and rain began to fall in sporadic sheets. The forest, which had seemed vibrant and alive in the morning, now felt like a cage. Shadows twisted unnaturally beneath the trees, and the sound of dripping water mimicked the rhythm of distant footsteps. They tried to rationalize wind, animals, or their minds playing tricks. Yet rationality faltered in the face of mounting evidence. As night fell again, the true terror began. A series of knocks echoed through the cabin walls, irregular, sharp, and deliberate. They came first on the back wall, then the front, then the roof. It was a pattern, almost communicative. Each knock made their hearts jump, their instincts scream. Emily suggested calling for help, but cell service was non-existent in this part of the mountains. Panic began to set in as the sound intensified, now accompanied by whispers, unintelligible yet filled with malice, carried on the wind. Mark, desperate, tried to document the events. He grabbed his camera and filmed the perimeter, flashlight in hand. Every corner he illuminated was empty, yet movement was felt. Shadows flitting at the edge of vision, quick and impossible to track. Emily and the third friend, Jason, clung to each other, their eyes darting constantly. The night stretched endlessly, a tapestry of fear and anticipation. Every noise was a threat, every shadow a predator. At around 2 a.m., the knocks stopped. Silence fell, heavy and unnatural. Relief was brief. Through the fogged windows, they saw shapes forming in the rain. Tall, thin, almost transparent figures moving deliberately between the trees. One stopped and seemed to stare directly at the cabin, though its features were indistinct. They froze, paralyzed, unable to comprehend or respond. The figures disappeared as quickly as they came, leaving the trio in a silence that screamed louder than any noise could. By sunrise, exhaustion overtook them. They left the cabin, leaving belongings behind, the forest behind them, a living, breathing entity that had claimed part of their minds. Even as they drove down the winding dirt road, the sensation of eyes watching never left them. They swore never to return. Yet the memory would haunt them for years, creeping into dreams, shadowing every solitary moment spent outdoors. And so, the White Mountains kept their secret, as they always had. A cabin isolated among the pines, where the hollow watcher waits, where fear lingers like mist, and where those who venture too far may find themselves marked, observed, and changed forever. The second story takes us deeper into the heart of the Pacific Northwest, where towering evergreens block out the sun even at midday, and the moss-covered forest floor hides secrets older than any human memory. Here, in the dense solitude of the Olympic National Forest, a small, abandoned cabin waits quietly, cloaked in shadow, its weathered boards and broken windows whispering warnings to anyone who dares approach. It was a group of college students, 3 young men and 2 women, who first stumbled upon this place during a weekend hiking trip. Their goal was simple: disconnect from the digital world, test their endurance in the wilderness, and create content for their social media channels. Yet, what they found at that secluded cabin would test not only their courage, but their very sanity. The path leading to the cabin was narrow and overgrown. Every step produced the sound of dry twigs snapping beneath boots. Yet, in the thick forest, those sounds seemed swallowed by the dense air. Birds were silent, and a damp fog hung low, clinging to their jackets and dripping from pine needles. As they drew closer, they noticed the cabin's peculiar design. Unlike other structures, this one had no chimney, no clear indication of how smoke could escape. Its windows were covered with darkened plastic, not glass, which gave the building a hollow, unnatural look. The students, eager for the thrill, laughed off the strange appearance, snapping photos and joking about cabin horror cliches. As night fell, they lit a small fire outside the cabin. Shadows danced on the tree trunks, long and flickering in the firelight. The air grew colder, unnaturally so, as if the warmth of their fire could not penetrate the forest's embrace. It started with a sound so subtle that at first they thought it was part of the forest. A soft scraping, like claws against wood. But it grew louder, deliberate, circling the cabin. They froze, glancing at each other. "Probably a raccoon," one said nervously, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere worsened. The students discovered old furniture covered in thick layers of dust. Remnants of past inhabitants that seemed frozen in time. A wooden table held a cracked bowl, still containing what appeared to be dried food. On one wall, crude symbols were scratched into the wood. Lines and shapes that did not match any known alphabet, but gave off an unmistakable sense of malevolence. Emily, the most observant of the group, pointed them out. "These aren't just old carvings. Someone, or something, made these recently," she said, her voice trembling. They decided to spend the night anyway. The fire provided comfort outside, but inside, darkness reigned. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and every creak of the wooden floor sounded amplified, almost as if the cabin itself was breathing. Soon, whispers began, soft, unintelligible, echoing around them as though the cabin walls had become a mouth speaking in tongues. The students clutched each other, trying to dismiss it as imagination. But the whispers grew louder, forming patterns that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. By midnight, the situation escalated. The fire outside flared suddenly, throwing erratic shadows across the surrounding trees. A sense of being watched became unbearable. One of the men, Jason, approached the cabin door to peer outside. The forest was empty, or so it seemed. Then, in the corner of his vision, he noticed a figure. Thin, pale, with long limbs, standing completely still between two massive pines. He blinked, and it vanished. No sound, no movement, nothing to mark its departure, except the oppressive weight of its presence. Inside, panic set in. The whispers now sounded like voices, chanting. The symbols on the wall seemed to pulse, blackened scratches widening as if alive. The students huddled together, terror rooting them to the floor. Emily's phone, her only connection to the outside world, flickered on and off, displaying static images of the cabin's interior from angles they had not observed, images they hadn't taken. The realization hit. They were being monitored, watched in real time by some unseen force. Hours dragged on. Every attempt to leave the cabin was met with an invisible barrier. Doors refused to open, windows jammed despite no visible obstruction. The forest outside, once a potential escape, now seemed a labyrinth. Shadows moved between trees with unnatural speed and precision, cutting off any clear path. One by one, the students felt the oppressive sensation of something touching them, brushing past them, yet vanishing when confronted. Panic became hysteria. Emily recalled a story she had read about the Silent Ones, a group of entities rumored to inhabit the Pacific Northwest. They were said to attach themselves to those who enter deep, forgotten spaces in the forest. They did not attack in the traditional sense, but fed on fear, growing stronger as terror escalated. The students laughed nervously at first, but the laughter died when they realized how accurate it felt. Every heartbeat, every gasp, was fuel for something unseen yet undeniably present. At approximately 3 a.m., a door slammed shut in the cabin, a force so violent it shook the walls. The students screamed, clutching each other as the whispers transformed into loud, guttural sounds, a language without form but saturated with intent. Shadows gathered in corners, dark pools pooling into shapes that defied description. They were aware of one another's presence, yet utterly alone in the cabin. Fear became tangible, pressing against their chests like a weight too heavy to lift. By dawn, the chaos ceased as suddenly as it began. The fire had burned low, and the forest outside appeared calm, almost inviting. Yet nothing felt normal. The students packed their belongings and fled, never looking back. Each swore to never speak of the events again. Yet, the images, sounds, and sensations followed them, infiltrating dreams, lingering in corners of their vision when they were alone. Even years later, Emily reported seeing figures in the periphery of her sight, shadows moving where there should be none. The cabin, forgotten by most, continues to exist in the forest, patient and waiting for the next intruders. The lesson of this story is chilling. Some spaces in the wilderness are alive in ways beyond comprehension. They observe, they judge, and they manipulate fear itself. The Pacific Northwest forests hide corners that humanity is not meant to trespass. And the abandoned cabins, long left to rot, act as beacons for those who dare to ignore the warnings of the natural world. For those who enter, the memory becomes a permanent scar, a haunting that exists even in bright daylight and crowded rooms. And so, the Olympic National Forest keeps its secret, as the White Mountains do. A cabin abandoned, untouched by humanity, yet never empty, where unseen forces wait, and where anyone who dares to enter may find themselves trapped in a waking nightmare, pursued not by monsters of flesh, but by entities that manipulate perception, fear, and the very boundaries of reality itself. The third story is set in the remote forests of northern Maine, where the air is thick with the scent of pine and the silence can be deafening. A young couple, Mark and Sophie, both avid hikers and self-proclaimed thrill seekers, had planned a weekend getaway far from cell service, far from civilization, and far from anything they considered familiar. Their destination was a cabin tucked in a valley so secluded that it appeared on no map they could find. Only a local, old-timer at a gas station had mentioned it, warning them vaguely about the woods that take people, a phrase they dismissed with laughter. The approach to the cabin was treacherous. Narrow dirt trails wound through dense undergrowth, the ground uneven and slick from recent rain. The trees were unusually tall, their tops forming a green canopy that filtered out the sun almost entirely. Every few minutes, they heard the sound of snapping branches and leaves rustling. But whenever they turned, nothing was there. By mid-afternoon, the path opened into a clearing, and the cabin came into view. It was small, constructed from dark logs that had weathered decades of storms, with a sagging roof and a wooden porch that creaked ominously. Despite its foreboding appearance, Mark and Sophie were excited. They entered the cabin, setting down their packs and inspecting the interior. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by every movement, and the faint smell of rot was pervasive. The cabin had only a few rooms, a main living area with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom. Everything was old, yet carefully maintained in a way that suggested someone had lived there recently, or someone was living there still. Sophie noted odd scratches on the floorboards near the corners, deep enough to suggest clawing, not human hands. Mark joked that perhaps a raccoon had taken residence, but the unease that settled over them was undeniable. The first night was peaceful, almost deceptively so. They built a fire in the fireplace, its flames casting shadows that danced across the walls. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath. They ate a simple dinner and went to bed early, lulled by the sound of wind rustling through the treetops. But as midnight approached, strange things began to happen. First, they heard whispering voices, indistinct and soft, coming from outside the cabin. Then, faint tapping sounds started on the walls, like fingernails dragging across wood. At first, they thought it might be an animal. But when Mark opened the door, the forest was silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no animals. Only darkness stretching endlessly. The sounds inside the cabin grew louder. The tapping became scratching, circling the room. The whispers became murmurs, overlapping, speaking a language neither could understand. Sophie tried to record the sounds on her phone, but each time she pressed the record button, it malfunctioned, displaying static. The cabin seemed to have a presence, alive and aware, feeding on their fear. They huddled together on the bed, trying to rationalize the events. But the sense of being watched was inescapable. Around 2 a.m., a new horror emerged. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted sharply. Their breath became visible, hanging in the air like smoke. Sophie noticed shadows moving independently of the firelight, stretching and twisting unnaturally across the walls. Then, from the corner of the room, a figure emerged. Tall, thin, and faceless, moving slowly toward them. The couple screamed, scrambling to the door, only to find it locked from the outside. Panic surged through them, realizing the cabin itself seemed to have trapped them inside. The figure did not speak, but the energy in the room was suffocating. Every instinct screamed at them to run, yet movement became impossible, as if the cabin had a gravity of its own, pulling them toward the center. Then came the whispers again, now in unison, chanting in a tone so low it resonated in their chest. Their phones flickered, displaying images of the cabin's interior, but from angles they could not have possibly seen. In the photos, the figure stood closer, always closer, its presence undeniable, oppressive. By morning, the figure had vanished, leaving behind only the echo of its presence. Mark and Sophie finally managed to force the door open and fled into the forest, not daring to look back. The cabin remained behind them, quiet, yet somehow aware of their departure. Weeks later, both reported strange occurrences in their own homes. Objects moving inexplicably, shadows at the edges of vision, the sense of being watched even when they were alone. They realized the cabin had left something with them, a lingering reminder that some places in the woods never truly release their visitors. The horror of this story lies not just in the figure itself, but in the idea that certain places carry a memory of fear. These remote cabins are not abandoned in the traditional sense. They exist as traps designed to ensnare, to observe, and to leave a permanent mark on anyone who enters. The woods themselves seem to conspire, isolating victims, bending perception, and amplifying the primal fear of the unknown. Mark and Sophie's experience is far from unique. Across North America, stories emerge of hikers, campers, and explorers who stumble upon abandoned cabins and experience events that defy explanation. The similarities are striking. Sudden cold, whispers in unknown tongues, shadows that move with intent, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. In many cases, victims report the sensation of time stretching and compressing, hours feeling like minutes, and minutes like eternity. The forest is not merely a backdrop, it is a participant in the terror. Experts in folklore and cryptid activity suggest that such places may be notes of concentrated supernatural energy. They theorize that over decades, the fear and isolation experienced by previous visitors accumulate, creating an invisible residue that affects anyone who enters. Some cabins are said to be alive, capable of manifesting entities to interact with intruders. These forces feed on emotion, particularly fear, growing stronger as panic escalates. The phenomenon is well documented in anecdotal accounts, though it remains largely unexplained by science. Ultimately, the story of Mark and Sophie serves as a cautionary tale. The lure of adventure and isolation can bring individuals into contact with forces beyond comprehension. Remote cabins, nestled deep within forests, are not just structures, they are traps, silent witnesses to countless intrusions, absorbing and reflecting the terror of those who enter. For those who dare to ignore the warnings of the woods, the memory of what they encounter never fades, lingering in dreams, in reflections, and in the quiet moments when one feels alone. And so, the northern Maine forests retain their secrets, waiting for the next unwitting visitors. The cabin stands as a sentinel, silent yet aware, a reminder that not all places in the wilderness are meant to be discovered. The horror is subtle, psychological, and deeply personal. Yet its impact is enduring, ensuring that anyone who experiences it will never truly feel safe in the world again. The woods are patient, and fear is their constant companion. The fourth and final story takes us to the shadowed depths of the Appalachian Mountains, where the forest grows so thick that sunlight barely reaches the forest floor. A group of college friends seeking an off-grid retreat to disconnect from the digital world discovered a cabin while exploring a little-known trail. Unlike the previous cabins, this one seemed almost too perfect. A neatly kept exterior, smoke curling from the chimney, and stacked firewood by the door. There were no signs of human life, yet everything suggested recent use. The sense of welcoming quickly turned to unease as soon as they stepped inside. The interior was deceptively cozy. Polished wooden floors, a warm fireplace, and simple furniture arranged neatly. On the walls hung old photographs of families, smiling and unaware of what lurked beyond the forest. Something about the images felt wrong, however. The eyes in the photos seemed to shift when the friends looked away, following their movements subtly. Laughter and joking quickly ceased as they each noticed this detail independently. The cabin, though quiet, had an oppressive energy that seemed to press down on their shoulders. That first night, the group built a fire and shared stories, trying to mask their growing unease with humor. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying a cadence that almost resembled voices, distant yet distinct. Around midnight, the first warning signs appeared. The youngest member of the group, Jenna, reported hearing faint footsteps on the porch, though everyone was inside. When they investigated, the door was locked, and no footprints could be found in the wet soil outside. Moments later, the temperature inside dropped sharply, frost forming on the edges of the windows. The friends huddled closer to the fire, yet it offered no comfort. Shadows in the corners of the room grew denser, darker, as if solidifying into shapes that the mind could almost recognize. Then came the whispering, unlike anything they had experienced. It was a chorus of low voices, speaking not words but emotions, despair, anger, regret, pushing the friends to the edge of panic. They tried to leave, but the doors and windows resisted every attempt to open. By the third hour of terror, the cabin seemed to twist and distort. Walls appeared to bend, ceilings lower, and the floor beneath them felt unstable. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet their bodies refused to respond. The whispers grew louder, now punctuated by a soft tapping that evolved into something resembling scratching claws against wood. The friends realized that whatever resided within the cabin fed on fear, on the adrenaline that coursed through their veins. The air was thick, heavy, almost viscous, as if they were moving through water rather than air. At one point, Jenna saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the firelight, tall, gaunt, its face obscured by shadow. She screamed, alerting the others, and the figure dissolved into the darkness. Objects in the room began moving on their own. Chairs slid across the floor. Photographs fell from the walls, and the fire sputtered violently, sending sparks flying. The friends could no longer differentiate between what was real and what was conjured by fear. Panic had become a physical presence, wrapping around them like chains, squeezing tightly with every heartbeat. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost all meaning within the cabin. The friends discovered old journals tucked in the fireplace, detailing experiences similar to their own, written by previous occupants who had vanished without a trace. The entries spoke of entities that could manipulate perception, that could trap and torment intruders for days or weeks, even if only a few minutes passed in the outside world. They read about shadow figures, sudden cold, whispers, and objects moving of their own accord, elements they were now experiencing firsthand. By morning, sunlight finally pierced the dense canopy, and the cabin seemed to release them from its grasp. The doors unlatched easily, the windows opened without resistance, and the oppressive energy dissipated into the warm mountain air. They fled without turning back, carrying with them the lingering sense of something watching, something aware, waiting for the next visitor foolish enough to enter. Months later, each friend reported nightmares that felt more real than waking life. They heard the whispers again, saw fleeting shadows at the corners of their vision, and felt a cold presence in empty rooms. The cabin had left an imprint, a permanent connection between them and the forest. Psychologists might dismiss these experiences as trauma-induced hallucinations. Yet the similarities across independent accounts suggest otherwise. Some forests, some cabins, harbor forces that science cannot explain, feeding on emotion, shaping reality, and leaving psychological scars that endure for years. This story, like the others, highlights a universal truth about fear in isolated places. The more remote, the more potent. Human brains are wired to detect threats, and in environments devoid of familiar cues, this detection system goes into overdrive. In these stories, cabins are more than structures. They are amplifiers of fear, conduits for unknown entities, and triggers for psychological and possibly supernatural phenomena. The isolation intensifies the senses, heightens paranoia, and allows the mind to fill in gaps with terror. In the deep woods, the unknown is an omnipresent companion. The stories of these remote cabins, whether in Maine, the Appalachians, or elsewhere, converge on similar experiences. The sudden cold, the whispers, the shadows that defy explanation, and the sense of being observed. People enter these cabins expecting solitude, adventure, or an escape from modern life, only to confront forces that challenge the very nature of perception and reality. The horror is not always in what is seen, but in what is felt, sensed, and intuited. A primal fear that taps into something ancient and relentless. Ultimately, these tales are a warning. Curiosity, adventure, or the allure of isolation can carry unexpected consequences. The forests are alive with memories, entities, and forces beyond human understanding. Cabins, though small and seemingly mundane, can become arenas for psychological and supernatural torment. Those who enter may leave physically unharmed, but they rarely leave untouched. Their experiences linger, subtly altering perception, embedding fear, and creating an invisible connection to a place they might never dare revisit. For those who explore the wilderness, respect and caution are paramount. The stories serve as reminders that some places are not merely abandoned. They are inhabited in ways that defy logic and science. The forest is patient, and fear is its constant companion. Even the bravest can be ensnared. And once the cabin has taken notice, it does not easily release its hold. As night falls and the woods grow quiet, remember these tales. The next time you stumble upon a cabin tucked deep within the forest, pause and consider. Has it been waiting for you? Or has it already taken notice, lying in silent watch, ready to pull your mind into the shadows? Some places are not meant for human intrusion, and some horrors linger long after the forest has returned to silence. Even now, as you lie in bed, reading these stories in the safety of your room, imagine the cabin in the distance, smoke curling from its chimney, its walls darkened by centuries of silence and fear. The forest around it waits patiently, and somewhere inside, shadows stretch and twist, aware that someone, somewhere, has noticed. And the whispers, faint and persistent, may be reaching across the miles, calling to your mind, reminding you that curiosity has its price and the deep woods always collect.